Last month, my mother-in-law laughed as my husband mocked my career at the dinner table. She plays dress up and calls it a job. No real man would tolerate that. When I spoke up, he rolled his eyes. Here we go again with the victim routine. Everyone just sat there. No one said a word. I cleared the plates, packed a bag that night, and left. Now he's calling Nonstop, saying, "You're blowing this out of proportion." Hi Reddit, I'm 34F. And I guess you could say I'm writing this partly to vent and partly because I need to hear from people who aren't involved. It's hard to tell this story to friends or family without it feeling messy. But the truth is, the mess was always there. I just stopped pretending I didn't see it. My name's Tessa. I've been married to Milo, 36M, for almost 5 years. We met through mutual friends at one of those small, casual get-togethers where no one really expects to meet someone important. But we hit it off fast. He was grounded, thoughtful, and had this calm confidence that made you feel like he had it all figured out. Back then, I was still working freelance, styling small editorial shoots, helping boutique shops curate their online look, assisting on lower-budget commercials. It wasn't glamorous, and it definitely didn't pay consistently, but I believed in it. I still do. When I met Milo, he seemed supportive of what I did. He liked that I was creative, said it was refreshing after dating people who only talked about climbing corporate ladders. I remember thinking we were a good balance. He worked in finance, steady, pragmatic, and I had the flexible, colorful job. At first, we celebrated that difference. But slowly, it started to feel like he was just tolerating it. The first year of marriage was quiet. We bought a small house outside the city, nothing extravagant, and set up routines that made things feel secure. But once the newness wore off, I noticed he stopped asking about my work. When I brought it up, he'd nod, but I could tell he wasn't really listening. I'd come home from a shoot excited to show him photos or talk about a breakthrough with a difficult client, and he'd be buried in spreadsheets or flipping through the news on his tablet. Still, I brushed it off. I figured everyone goes through that phase. People get comfortable, right? And then came Renata. Milo's mother is one of those women who operates like she's always being filmed for a documentary on elegance. She never wears anything twice in the same month, refers to magazines as publications, and corrects your grammar with a smile. I tried, in the early years, to connect with her. I brought her gifts from shoots I'd worked on, complimented her decor choices, even helped plan her 60th birthday tea. But it never seemed to matter. She always made little comments. Never outright insults, just subtle things. If I wore something simple, she'd ask if I'd been dressing for comfort lately. If I mentioned work, she'd tilt her head and say, "Oh, still doing the wardrobe thing?" And when I got a proper title on a project, stylist and creative consultant, she said, "That's a mouthful. What does it actually mean?" Milo never defended me. Not once. He'd either change the subject or chuckle like she wasn't being serious. I started to wonder if maybe he agreed with her, deep down. That thought was hard to shake. But the worst of it, the part one still replay in my head some nights, was Renata's birthday dinner last month. She invited us, along with a handful of family friends and Milo's brother Dorian. Everything was as curated as usual, the long table dressed with silver chargers, tapered candles that looked like they'd never been lit, and a floral centerpiece that looked too expensive to be real. She had assigned seats with tiny name cards. Mine was at the far end of the table, away from Renata and right next to the sideboard. We were about halfway through the main course when the conversation turned toward careers. Dorian was going on about some property he was flipping, and one of the guests was talking about market trends. It wasn't unusual for me to be quiet during these talks. I learned over the years that no one really asked about what I did. But that night, Renata turned to me with this smile like she just remembered I was there. "So, Tessa, are you still playing dress-up with the small business crowd?" It took me a second to process what she'd said. I smiled stiffly and replied, "Actually, I just wrapped a client shoot for a wellness line that's about to go national." Milo put his fork down, looked around the table, and said, "She plays dress-up and calls it a job. No real man would tolerate that." The laugh Renata let out still rings in my ears. It wasn't loud, but it was pointed. Dorian looked down, His wife cleared her throat awkwardly. No one else said anything. I turned to Milo, waiting, hoping he'd say it was a joke, or that he was just teasing. Instead, he rolled his eyes and muttered, "Here we go again with the victim routine." Just like that, the air shifted, and everyone stayed silent. No one looked at me. I stood up. I didn't slam my napkin down or make a scene. I just quietly started gathering the dishes nearest to me. Renata's voice floated in behind me, "Oh, Tessa, leave it. We have someone for that." But I kept going. I carried the plates to the kitchen, rinsed them one by one, then went back to the table and excused myself. I didn't cry in the car. I didn't shout. I just drove home, packed a weekend bag, and left. I didn't even take everything, just a few clothes, my laptop, and my work folders. I wanted to stay with my friend Ava. She didn't ask many questions. She just made tea and let me sit in silence. That was 4 weeks ago. Since then, Milo has called every day, left messages, sent emails, texted mutual friends to check on me. His messages range from apologetic to annoyed. "You're blowing this out of proportion," he said in one. "It was just a joke. Can we please be adults about this?" But what he doesn't know is that I found something while I was at Ava's. I wasn't looking for it. It was in an envelope tucked into one of the folders I had brought, an old file from when we were setting up our joint finances. And what was inside? Well, it changed everything. It was a manila folder, one I hadn't touched in over a year. We had used it when we were applying for a loan together. Back then, I thought we were building something, maybe a studio space for me, maybe a second property Milo had been researching. I honestly can't remember which idea we landed on. A lot of things got floated and then quietly dropped. Inside were the usual documents: tax returns, credit reports, bank statements. But something was tucked in between two sheets like it had been stuffed there hastily. A printed email. From Milo. To his friend Everett, someone I'd only met once, briefly, at a holiday party. The subject line said, "Need advice, Tessa's business again." It wasn't a long email, just a few lines. But each word felt like a small betrayal. She's still talking about opening a space. I keep telling her we need to be smart about spending, but she's not listening. She thinks this hobby is going to turn into a full career. Honestly, I'm tempted to let her go through with it just so she learns the hard way. But I don't want the debt tied to my name if it crashes. I read it 3 times. Slowly, trying to figure out when this was written. I looked at the date. Nearly 18 months ago. Around the same time, we had started drafting a business plan for a potential client-facing studio. The plan I ended up scrapping after Milo told me we'd revisit it when the time was right. I remember how disappointed I was when he said it, but I trusted him. I figured he was looking out for our future. Now I realized he had been protecting his future, not ours. Mine didn't seem to factor in much at all. I didn't call him. I didn't respond to his texts. I didn't even tell Ava right away. I just sat with it. For the first time in a long time, I let myself think about all the times I had been made to feel silly, dramatic, emotional, unrealistic. Every time I had to smile through a comment from Renata or pretend Milo's teasing didn't sting. There was this particular memory that wouldn't leave me alone. A few years ago, we had gone to one of those family lake weekends that Renata loved to organize. She always rented out a big house, invited her bridge club friends, and made it sound like a retreat. But it was never restful. There were schedules, dress codes, and constant whispers about who gained weight or whose marriage seemed strained. One night, I was sitting on the porch trying to sketch ideas for a client's fall campaign when Milo came out and said, "Don't you ever just relax? You're always pretending to work. No one expects anything from you up here." I laughed at the time. I thought he was trying to be light. But now, I realize how much he meant it. He didn't see my work as real. And I think, deep down, he never did. In the following days, he kept reaching out. His messages grew more persistent. First, it was the concerned, soft-voiced Milo. Then the logical one. "Tessa, come home and let's talk like adults." Then came the guilt trips. "You're hurting more people than you think." Finally, he switched to pressure. "If you don't want to be married, just say it. Don't play games." He kept calling what happened at the dinner a misunderstanding. Said I was making it bigger than it needed to be. He even had the nerve to say I had embarrassed him in front of his family by leaving without saying goodbye. But none of that stung quite as much as when he asked me, in a voice that sounded truly baffled, "Is this really about what I said? Or are you just using that as an excuse?" It made me wonder how long he'd been waiting for me to break, just so he could be the one who got to say, "See? She's emotional. She's unstable. She's the problem." I haven't responded to any of his messages. Not because I'm trying to punish him, but because I don't think I have anything left to say. At least not yet. But something happened earlier this week that brought things to a head in a way I didn't expect. It wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't loud. It was quiet. So quiet it felt like the ground shifted under my feet without a sound. I was helping Ava clean out her garage, just something to keep me busy, and she handed me a box she found tucked behind some old storage shelves. I thought it was one of hers, but when I opened it, I saw my handwriting. Inside were materials from when I first launched my freelance business. Notebooks filled with sketches, brand mock-ups, client notes, feedback emails. Things I hadn't looked at in years. There was even a journal where I had written goals, small ones, like land a repeat client, and big ones, like run my own team one day. Reading through it reminded me of who I was before I got used to shrinking myself to keep the peace. And then I found something else at the bottom of the box. Something that didn't belong to me. I didn't know how it got there. I didn't recognize it at first. It was a folder, thin and unmarked, almost too plain to notice. It didn't have my handwriting on it, which is what caught my eye. When I opened it, there were just a few sheets inside, stapled neatly. The first page was a copy of a lease agreement. Not ours. It was dated about 10 months ago. The lessee was a business registered under a name I didn't recognize right away, Red Cedar Outfitters. The address was a small commercial unit in a part of town that's popular with boutique startups. I kept scanning the page until I saw the names listed under the business partnership, Milo and Renata. I sat there staring at it for what felt like an hour. At first, I thought it had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe Milo had invested in a shop as a side project. He had the resources, and he did talk often about wanting to diversify. But the more I looked at the papers, the less innocent it seemed. The business description included styling consultations, seasonal lookbooks, and even a showroom for product placement. It was basically my business idea, almost word for word. I dug deeper through the folder. There were emails, printed screenshots, and even a few early concept designs. Some of them were taken directly from a pitch deck I had created 2 years ago when I first floated the idea of launching my own studio. The deck had only been shared with Milo. He had helped me format it, gave me suggestions on wording, told me not to share it with just anyone until we had our ducks in a row. I trusted him. Now it was sitting in a folder, stripped of my name, but kept intact enough to make it clear where it came from. He had taken my work, my concept, my dream, and opened a business with his mother, Renata, the same woman who once said styling wasn't a real job, who laughed when I mentioned opening a space, who rolled her eyes when I told her I'd booked my first client independently. She had used my idea, and her son had helped her do it. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't tell Ava right away. I just sat there, feeling like the walls around me had been gently, methodically pushed inward over time until I couldn't move. That night, I went online. I searched the business. Their site was polished, slick, with a muted color scheme and language that sounded eerily familiar. Some of the copy was taken directly from my own branding templates. They had even used a version of the tagline I had been workshopping months ago. The tagline I'd once pitched to Milo while we were eating dinner on the back porch. He said it sounded a little too niche at the time. Now it was front and center on the homepage of his business. And the final gut punch? They were already featured in a local magazine as a mother-son duo reinventing the boutique styling world. There was a whole article, photos, quotes, the works. Renata was beaming in every image. Milo had on that same confident, measured smile he wore when we first met. He talked about how his mother's lifelong passion for aesthetics inspired the brand. Not a single mention of me. Of the 2 years I spent trying to build something. Of the nights I stayed up sketching concepts. Of the client meetings I held in borrowed spaces. Of the way Milo would quietly nod along when I shared progress, only to dismiss it the next day. That was the moment something inside me shifted. It wasn't just hurt. It was clarity. Milo and Renata didn't just overlook me. They erased me. They took what I built and molded it into something they could present as their own, polished, respectable, and untainted by my involvement. And they did it without blinking. That's when I knew this wasn't just about a bad marriage or a toxic mother-in-law. This was war. And I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to throw things or show up at their front door demanding answers. No, I was going to be smart. I started by going through everything I had ever shared with Milo: files, design mock-ups, brand proposals, emails, concept photos. I organized them, backed them up, and timestamped what I could. I also dug out the email where I had sent him the original pitch deck for my studio idea. It was all there, clear as day. I made an appointment with a friend of Ava's, someone who had worked in small business law for years. I didn't tell her the full story at first. Just asked general questions about intellectual property. What counted as protected material? What rights I might have if a personal concept was used without credit? She didn't ask why I was asking. She just answered everything clearly. And when I showed her a sample of the overlapping materials, she looked up slowly and said, "You might have more leverage than you think." But I wasn't going to stop there. This wasn't just about legal action. It was about making sure everyone saw them for who they really were. I started contacting old clients, collaborators, people I had worked with who knew my vision. I asked casual questions, sent feelers out. I let them know I was planning something new and wanted to reconnect. Almost all of them responded with enthusiasm, and a few of them had already seen the article about Milo and Renata's launch. One even said, "I thought it looked like something you would have done." Exactly. I began drafting a plan. Carefully, quietly. And while Milo was still texting me things like, "Can we please act like adults?" and "You're being emotional, Tessa," I was setting the stage. Because if they wanted to take credit for what I built, if they wanted to rewrite the story with themselves as the visionaries, then they were going to have to live with the truth being dragged out in the open. Brick by brick, I was going to take back what they stole. I didn't confront Milo immediately after discovering the folder. I took a few days to let everything sink in. During that time, I stayed with Ava. She gave me space but also reminded me, gently, that I didn't owe anyone silence anymore. That was hard to accept. I'd spent so many years tiptoeing around Milo's moods and Renata's passive judgment, trying to keep the peace, trying not to make a scene. But for once, I wasn't interested in staying quiet. So I went methodically. I took the evidence I had, emails, timestamped documents, digital backups, and met with Ava's friend, Leah, a small business attorney with a sharp memory and calm voice. She had handled several intellectual property cases and immediately saw what had happened. Her words stuck with me. This wasn't an accident. It was careful, quiet, and planned. We sent a cease and desist letter to both Milo and Renata through official channels. It outlined my ownership of the original concept and demanded they stop using any branding, language, or design elements pulled from my materials. We also requested acknowledgement of my role in the development of the business, though, honestly, I knew they'd never admit it. Sure enough, Renata replied with a letter full of soft, formal denial. She claimed the business had been an evolution of years of conversation, that family ideas often blend together, and that she'd always meant to include me in some vague, undefined way. It was a carefully worded deflection. No apology. No accountability. Just a casual attempt to fold me back into the narrative, now that they realized I wasn't going to stay quiet. But I didn't push for court. Leah agreed that litigation might drag on and drain more energy than it was worth. What I wanted wasn't just justice, it was restoration. To reclaim what they tried to take and move forward on my terms. So I took a different path. I relaunched my studio, this time for real. I used the name I'd dreamt up 2 years earlier, Still and Sage. I rented a cozy space just a few blocks from a neighborhood arts market and repainted it myself. White with sage green accents, clean and warm. Ava helped me hang sheer curtains, set up shelving, and move in my old dress form and sewing table. I bought a secondhand espresso machine. I put a little sign in the window, opening soon, a studio for style, story, and self. I reached out to old clients and collaborators, people I'd styled for before, people who had seen my early ideas. I told them I was back, and to my surprise, nearly all of them responded. Many had heard of Red Cedar, and a few even said they had recognized the design as very you when they first saw the promo photos. One of them, a journalist I'd worked with years earlier for a fashion spread, offered to interview me again, this time as the subject of the story. She asked me to speak candidly, and I did. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. I talked about how it feels to be quietly erased, How your work can be used to elevate someone else while you're told to stay humble. How ideas can be stolen without a single door slammed. Just the slow, careful closing of opportunities. I talked about rebuilding, not with fire, but with patience and proof. The piece was published online under the title, "She Stepped Away from the Business She Built. Now, she's taking it back." Within a week, my inbox exploded. Former clients reached out. Young creatives asked to intern. A few women sent messages saying they'd experienced something similar and felt inspired to finally go after what was theirs. And slowly, Red Cedar started to wither. They didn't post any official response, but the boutique's online presence went quiet. Events were quietly canceled or rescheduled. Their last blog post went up 2 weeks after the article, featuring a generic update about shifting priorities and restructuring behind the scenes. Then the site disappeared completely. Gone. A mutual acquaintance eventually told me that Renata was completely devastated and that Milo had felt betrayed that I'd gone public. But I didn't know either of them my silence. Milo tried to reach out, first with a short email, "Can we talk?" Then with a longer message filled with soft excuses. He said he never meant for things to get like this, that he only helped his mother because she was struggling to feel fulfilled, that he hadn't realized how serious I was about my concept. But I had the email where he said it was too niche. I didn't reply. The last message I ever received from him said, "You really blew this out of proportion." That's when I knew I'd made the right choice walking away. Because even at the end, he couldn't bring himself to see what he'd done. Not the betrayal, not the erasure, not the slow dismantling of my confidence under the disguise of support. And Renata? She went back to hosting charity brunches and making vague comments to friends about how young people just don't understand tradition anymore. She never tried to reach out directly, maybe because she knew she'd have nothing left to stand on. I finalized the divorce 3 months later. Clean split. No children. No property battles. I kept what mattered, my work, my name, and the quiet knowledge that I'd built something honest. It's been a little over a year now. Still and Sage has grown slowly but steadily. I now mentor 2 young stylists who are wildly creative and refreshingly kind. One of them reminds me a lot of myself in my 20s, before I learned how easily some people will take credit for your light while trying to dim it. I teach them everything I've learned, but most of all, I teach them to protect their ideas. I sometimes walk past the storefront where Red Cedar used to be. The windows are dusty now, with a paper sign that says "Available for lease." There's no trace of their logo, no reminder of the boutique that launched with borrowed vision. And yet, it's the perfect full circle, because while they folded in silence, I reopened in my own voice. No borrowed hands, no second names, just me and what I always knew I could do. So that's the story. I didn't just get revenge. I got free. And in the end, that's worth more than anything they tried to take.